Well, joining me for our Tuesday panel are National Senator for Queensland, Susan McDonald. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
And Labor Senator for New South Wales, Tim Ayres. Welcome.
G'day.
Now, Tim, if we could start with you on the issue of the big stick legislation, because that has changed a bit in the last few hours or so. Anthony Albanese says that the legislation has changed since it was initially introduced before the election, enough for the party to give it conditional support, but there is still that sticking point about privatisation. Can you walk us through what that actual concern is?
Certainly can. The legislation that was brought last time around to the last session was a stalking horse for privatisation of energy assets, and was going to give the Commonwealth the power to force state governments to offload energy assets. And we know that the big issues that are driving electricity prices up and driving down investor confidence are a lack of a coherent energy policy and privatisation of state government assets. That concern has been resolved. Labor will insist upon the amendments that it's pushed and fought for, and we understand that that will be exactly what will be included in the legislation: a prohibition on privatisation and partial privatisation of electricity assets. On that basis, it'll go forward with Labor support. Having said that, the real issue here is the Commonwealth Government doesn't have an energy plan. This is better than no plan at all, but it doesn't represent a plan for the future of the energy sector, and that's what's driving investor confidence in energy down. It's also what's driving investor confidence down more broadly. BlueScope Steel just made a decision to build a $1.5 billion steel plant in the United States rather than in Australia because of a lack of confidence in Australia's energy policy settings. And further than that, the lack of energy policy is driving electricity prices up for ordinary households. It's just time for the government to take responsibility for its role as the government of Australia and act and drive a real energy plan forward. And the problem the government has is its party room is captured by sort of cellar-dwelling climate change deniers, and it's stopped at having an energy policy for 6 years now.
Before I give Senator McDonald a right of reply on that one, I want to pick up on some of the language you used there, and it was the similar language to your leader. You're saying that Labor will insist that this amendment is made. We've heard that language before on issues such as income tax, on national security legislation. Labor haven't been successful in pushing amendments there. They've then voted in favour of the legislation. Are you just laying the groundwork to roll over on another issue here?
Labor will hold absolutely firm on the privatisation of electricity assets. It's bad for consumers, it's bad for the energy sector, and it's what's been driving electricity prices up all around the country.
So it's
we're very confident that that's our proposition.
Senator McDonald, one of the key criticisms of this proposal since it was first mooted before the last election is that it is incredibly interventionist. It basically goes against the Liberal and National Party's ideals of a free market here. How can you continue to push a proposal that has been criticised by the industry and could completely take a stick to investor confidence?
Look, I think the important thing to start with is that energy prices and energy supply is generated by the states. And there is a massive lack of understanding from Labor that this is somehow a national policy that's required, when it is the states that decide whether or not they're going to mine gas, whether or not they're going to generate more electricity using power, using solar, using hydrogen, whatever it might be, but it does remain the state's responsibilities. With regard to it being a strong signal to the electricity companies, I think we can be sure that there has been a failure in this marketplace. Electricity costs have tripled within the last 10 years. And again, I wouldn't expect Labor to be as close to this, but certainly as a small business party, as a big business party, we understand that the costs of doing business are crippling business in Australia. And Senator Ayres just made the point of a business going offshore to invest. It is a real threat, it is a serious threat, and it's one that I'm delighted that as a government and an opposition we will come together and send this strong signal to the energy companies that for too long they've focused on profits and not on consumers and not on business, and that's got to change.
You cited there the incredibly steep rises in power prices over the last 10 years. The Coalition has been in power for 6 of those years. Yeah. How much responsibility does the Coalition have to take for, as Senator Ayres has put it, not having a coherent energy policy and allowing this environment to continue?
Well, my state of Queensland has supported the nation's electricity supply over the last few years. I think it is up to the state governments to ensure that they are bringing more supply to the market, managing prices, and that's what Queensland has been carrying the load of supply. But costs have just gone through the roof, and business and consumers can't operate in this environment anymore.
If this issue of privatisation is a deal breaker for Labor, how likely are you to get the Senate crossbench over the line?
Oh, well, that's a good question, and I guess we will have those negotiations, but I feel confident that this is the right signal to the market. It's the right legislation, and I look forward to seeing it passed.
It's not a plan for the future of the energy sector. It's not a plan that's going to resolve the substantial concerns that investors have and households have. Every year, year in, year out, over the 6 years of this government, electricity prices have gone up, jobs have gone offshore. It's a government that misunderstands its responsibility. Its responsibility is to deliver an energy plan for Australia. Getting lost in the weeds of Commonwealth-state relations and the ins and outs of climate denialism really is letting the Australian people down, and the government needs to bring forward an energy plan that's capable of building investor confidence.
I don't agree, Senator, and I think a lot of Australians who are at the coalface would understand that this is energy that is generated by the states. This is not the federal government's. They do not manage poles and wires. They do not generate electricity. This is the responsibility of the states, and they do have to do more. And consumers and businesses, as you've rightly identified, can't go on like this. But this is not the responsibility of the federal government. These are strong signals, though. And you talked about a future plan for energy. This is a future plan for a highly uncompetitive industry. And I think it is important that that this signal be sent, and I think we'll see industry react because they don't want the threat of divestment or of any other penalties.
It in no way represents a plan. If we're moving from a phase of coalition policy making in this area from climate change denialism to buck passing, well, I'm not sure that's a welcome development. What we need is policy certainty. Not the 17th of 16 energy policy plans, but a plan that Australian people...
No doubt we will. No doubt we will hear more about this as the legislation gets into the Senate and is debated. No doubt with speeches from your good selves as well. I do want to move on to one other issue which has been dominating attention here today, and that is Syria. Tim Ayres, we've heard some quite harrowing stories about women and children being feeling like they've been abandoned in these refugee camps in Syria, the government not saying that they are going to be bringing them home. What do you think is the public perception here? Is there sympathy for their plight, or is it a situation of they've got themselves into this issue, this problem?
Well, I think the first thing to say is there's an intensification of concern because of President Trump's announcement about the withdrawal of American forces from northern Syria. That has lifted concerns and enabled Turkish aggression in northern Syria. Now, Turkey and only Turkey is responsible for what they do in northern Syria. That point's been made, but I think it's fair for Australian policymakers to take the same approach that senior Republicans in the United States have taken, criticising President Trump for the arbitrary and abrupt nature of this announcement and its consequences. On to the situation for ISIS fighters held in the camp in northern Syria. I would say that, of course, I'm deeply concerned about the situation for children. Like the leader of the Labor Party, less sympathetic for people who've made a choice to be there with ISIS. It's a murderous terrorist regime. There is a framework for dealing with the return of foreign fighters. It's gone through the Parliament. There have been many changes and amendments to national security legislation, including most recently that framework, and that framework ought to be rigorously applied. I agree with what the government said about the concern for the security and safety of Australian personnel involved in any repatriation efforts. Only the government has the briefings and the intelligence that they will need to make those assessments. It is a diabolical position.
I might get your view on this one, because your fellow Queenslander, the Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton, says that some of these women do pose a security threat. Doesn't Australia still have a responsibility to bring them back to Australia, put them in some sort of detention facility here, rather than letting them languish in Syria?
Yeah, well, I guess I would just like to start by agreeing with Senator Ayres that this is highly distressing. and the actions, or the unilateral actions of Turkey to go into northeast Syria are highly distressing, and they've resulted in some very bad outcomes, which includes more and more people in these internal displacement camps. It is now too dangerous for us to be sending Australian consul workers and staff into there. So unfortunately, we are now in a difficult situation of not wanting to add more people into the mix. So I agree that there is a very good and sound process for considering these people, should they come back to Australia, being assessed by the authorities, but at the moment, unfortunately, that option has been taken from our hands, and until the situation settles more.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. We do have to allow you to get to question time. So Senator Tim Ayres, Senator Susan McDonald, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks, Matt.
Now, anyone who has travelled overseas knows the drill when you return to Australia.